I am Sarah Gutterman. I'm CEO of Green Builder Media, and I'm so pleased to be here with you today. For those of you who regularly attend our webinars, you know that our fearless moderator, Mike Collignan, is usually the first face that you see and voice that you hear. He is happily on a family vacation this week, so we're going to miss him terribly. I'm going to try to field this one on my own. I cannot say that I'll be hugely graceful at the end as I'm trying to field your questions and answer them, but I'll do my best, I promise. Before we dive in, I want to first thank Mary Kestner, our production manager. I always like to call her our wizard behind the curtain. She makes it all happen. So Mary, thank you. I know you're listening in. We can't do any of this without you. Thank you all for being here. Thanks so much for your time and for your interest in such an important topic. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to talk with you about this topic today. But also thank you to our sponsors. We have PowerShift by NV Energy, Bosch Home Comfort, and James Hardie as our sponsors today. I will talk about them a little bit later, each of them in the context of the webinar. But for now, I'll just give a quick intro to all three of them. PowerShift by NV Energy is a program that helps residential and business customers conserve energy and save money on their power bills. PowerShift is a one-stop resource to find energy-efficient products and services. And for more information, you can visit nvenergy.com/PowerShift. Bosch Home Comfort is a leading source of high-quality heating, cooling, and hot water systems. Bosch is committed to reinventing energy efficiency and paving a path for home comfort electrification by offering smart products that can work together as integrated systems for full-scale electrification. And James Hardie is the North American leader in fiber cement exterior designing solutions. Hardie products offer personalized design options with trusted protection, low maintenance, and long-lasting beauty. As the #1 producer of high-performance fiber cement siding in North America, James Hardie offers siding and accessories for every home style. So thank you again to PowerShift by NV Energy, James Hardie, and Bosch Home Comfort. We could not do this work without the support of our generous sponsors. Now, shifting into the webinar. So part of the reason why I am so excited about this topic, getting to net zero carbon in the built environment and zero carbon homes in particular, is because I have been doing this work for a couple of decades. Actually, I was in sustainability before co-founding Green Builder Media 20 years ago. You'll hear a lot from us. Next year is our 20th anniversary. We're so excited about it. But I have never seen the pace of change and the momentum towards a decarbonized, sustainable built environment that I am seeing today in those 2 decades that we've been working at Green Builder Media. And the conversation is decidedly shifting from net zero energy, which I think we all know measures the operational emissions and energy use of a home or a building, to net zero carbon, which is a much more robust assessment of embodied carbon and operational carbon, from raw material procurement to product manufacturing to transportation, installation, packaging, shipping, operations of the building, and then end-of-life considerations. And this transformation is being driven by really a perfect storm and a combination of an evolving regulatory landscape, mushrooming consumer demand, investor and lender requirements, and then just general shifting market dynamics and economics. We're going to talk about all of those things within this webinar. And what I'm also really happy to say is that builders are really actively exploring net zero carbon strategies as a key factor of differentiation in response to this surging demand and evolving regulations and mandates and requirements. In fact, our Cognition Smart data shows that 75% of green builders are optimistic about the prospects, the near and long-term prospects of the housing market, because they see that the Inflation Reduction Act and other market dynamics, again, which we'll explore, are really shifting this demand and this drive towards net zero carbon. They see IRA funding, both at the builder level as well as the consumer level, really pulling through electrification and energy efficiency, and also net zero carbon demand and technologies. And we're also seeing an evolution in things like environmental product declarations and carbon offsets, again, all of which we'll get into in this webinar. But I want to start with the why. So we've hit 1.5 degrees Celsius warming in the past 12 months. We're going to 2 degrees in the next 12 months. So there is a very real environmental reality. And the reason why climate scientists set that 2-degree threshold of global warming is because they don't know how to model over 2 degrees. We get into 2.5, 3, 4 degrees. They don't know how to model what's going to happen because of what's called a threat multiplier with respect to climate change. And so that's why they set that 2 degrees threshold. And that's why it's so important for us to stay under that. Now, there's a lot of climate science that shows that if we stay on our current trajectory, we are going to hit that 2 degrees in the next 12 months, as I said, and then get into the 3 or 4 degrees in the next 3 to 5 years. And that is pretty scary. However, there's also a lot of climate science, that shows that if we change our current trajectory, if we mitigate emissions, and if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then we can very quickly and fairly dramatically decrease the impacts of climate change. There is still that threat multiplier. We really just don't know what's going to happen because we are in uncharted territory. However, it's not all gloom and doom, but it's also why we have to act quickly. And while 2030 commitments are awesome and we need them, I'm going to submit to you a little bit later in this presentation that that's actually not fast enough to act, right? It's too long. We've got to act quicker, we've got to act more swiftly, and there are some mechanisms that enable us to act faster. The other element about why zero carbon that is of paramount importance and is really kind of just breaking open as a social norm, we'll say, is that this social reality of very high levels of climate anxiety. We see that millennials and younger Gen Zs are really concerned about climate change. In fact, climate change is their #1 global priority, more so than gun violence and economic or social or political instability, more so than even other types of top global concerns. And we see that, again, through Cognition Smart data, that 77% of millennials and Gen Zs consider the future to be frightening. 56% say that they think that humanity is doomed. And so there are some very real social concerns that are driving this demand for net zero carbon buildings. And then, of course, we have the blend of investor and lender and supply chain demand, where investors are certainly now requiring whether it's ESG reporting or more transparency in climate risk disclosure and emissions reporting. We're also starting to see, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, more climate risk disclosure requirements. For example, the state of California recently passed 2 climate laws that are going to require scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. The SEC, of course, recently passed their climate risk disclosures that are going to require scope 1 and 2 emissions reporting. And now more and more, we're also starting to see municipalities, literally from California to Massachusetts, starting to require not just net zero energy and net zero water plans, but actually net zero carbon plans when builders and developers go to submit permits. And they are also asking questions about low carbon products, say that have EPDs, as well as they're starting to look at requirements for embodied and operational carbon reporting to enhance that accountability and that transparency. Now, net zero carbon is particularly important in the built environment because of how conspicuously consumptive the building sector is. I think we all know these stats, but According to the DOE, US homes and buildings account for about 40% of our nation's energy use, 70% of our electricity use, and 40% of our total emissions. And the UN tells us that emissions from buildings must be reduced by 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050 if we're going to stay under that 2 degrees warming threshold. But unfortunately, not even 1% of our existing buildings are net zero carbon today. Now, with all of this said, I mentioned just shifting consumer demand and market dynamics. And I think that, again, when we survey our early adopter and first mover audience, the majority of whom now are millennials and Gen Z homeowners and aspiring homeowners, we see that there's really no question within these younger generations that decarbonization is a positive thing. It's helpful to business. It results in enhanced innovation. It generates positive brand equity, yields greater financial returns, and mitigates risk for companies. We also see that there's a growing level of importance that millennials and Gen Zs report to us in terms of living in a net zero carbon home. So you can see here kind of broken out by generation, a question that we ask pretty consistently to our audience about how important is living in a net zero carbon home. And you can see that the orange and the turquoise are very important and, you know, highly important, and the yellow is important. So all of the generations are shifting from less important to more important in general. We also see something that's really interesting, and we started seeing this even before the pandemic with millennials as they became more active home buyers, and they're now you know, over half of all home purchase applications. Gen Zs are just starting to hit the scene with respect to home buying, but their numbers are going to grow in a hockey stick-like fashion over the next handful of years, because about 45% of Gen Zs say that they want to own a home in the next 5 years. Homeownership is something that they want and is very meaningful to them. And an interesting differentiation for millennials and Gen Zs relative to traditionalist boomers and Xers is that there's a greater willingness to look at full cost as opposed to just upfront cost, first cost, or lowest price per square foot. And consistently, when we ask our consumer audience, younger generations say that they are more willing to invest in sustainability upgrades like energy efficiency and electrification than older generations. And those younger generations, at least their purchase intent is consistently higher than what our builder audience thinks that they will invest over time. And I think that this is really because, you know, 85% of our millennial and Gen Z audience say that they have been directly impacted by climate change, and they feel responsible for their impact on the environment. In fact, cognition data shows that about 64% of these individuals report that they feel guilty about their environmental impact. 61% report feelings of sadness and anger and powerless and helplessness when it comes to mitigating the impacts of climate change. And so I think that's partly why these younger generations are looking for a blend of attainability, certainly, and sustainability. So when I say attainability, that's my word for affordability, just because we know that affordable housing has a very strict definition. And while affordability is absolutely top of mind, these younger generations absolutely are looking for ways to increase their total value of homeownership and lower their total cost of homeownership. And they're definitely willing to forego some of the fancy bells and whistles and even extra space in favor of upgrades that drive towards a net zero carbon built environment, that lower monthly utility bills, that keep them healthy and enhance the resiliency of their homes. When we talk with our builder audience, I mentioned this earlier, about 75% of our builder audience feels that the incentives and the rebates and funding from the Inflation Reduction Act will have a positive impact on their business because of things like Provision 45L, which provides them $2,500 per home for Energy Star certified homes and $5,000 per home for zero energy ready homes. And it's also pulling through energy efficiency and electrification upgrades. Now, keep in mind, our builders and our audience, they are just like our consumer audience, they're early adopters and they're first movers. So they are the builders that are already building above code. Even the more stringent codes, and they are the ones that are committing to go full zero energy ready certified, or in some cases, even full zero energy, net zero energy. And now more and more, interestingly, they are starting to commit to going net zero carbon. And so when we survey our readers, our builder readers audience, we do see an increased demand. They tell us that they're seeing an increased demand from their home buyers for everything from energy efficient insulation, windows and doors, lighting, smart home controls, heat pump technology, solar and storage, and so forth. And they are absolutely interested and willing to embrace net zero carbon technologies, ranging again from demand side energy management systems to cool roof systems, hot water recycling systems, high performance building envelope systems, windows and doors, etc. And then beyond the homes and the projects that they are building, our builder audience also tells us that they are enhancing the sustainability, not just of their own businesses, but of their supply chain. So everyone that provides products to them and services and even contractors. And that's really to enhance the accuracy and the reliability of their own reporting so that they can address their own scope 3 reporting, frankly. It's also to help them develop innovative products and solutions. It's in response to pressure from investors and consumers, and also to prevent greenwashing claims and enhance transparency. Now, another aspect beyond the consumer demand and the builder response that's driving us towards a net zero built environment is this shifting regulatory landscape. And so net zero carbon, folks, it is an impending reality, and I'm so glad that you're here listening to this today, because that means that you are future-proofing your own business. And again, it's really because of this combination of investor requirements, lender conditions, consumer demand, and now evolving regulations. And there are some recent announcements and milestones that serve as important indicators that this transition to net zero carbon is well underway. And I want to talk about a few of those. So the first, I mentioned earlier, climate risk disclosure requirements. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, it's really transparent and accountable and reliable reporting on emissions from companies. So there's 3 types of emissions. There's scope 1, which are direct emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by a company. There's scope 2, which are indirect emissions from purchased power, electricity, heating and cooling, etc. And then there's scope 3 emissions, which is basically everything else. And scope 3 emissions comprise generally about 80 to 90% of a company's carbon emissions, because it entails and it's comprised of all of the company's activities, like purchase goods and services, business travel, offices, operations, employee commuting, waste disposal, investments, leased assets, and even end of life product considerations. So scope 3 is a big one, and it's one that we're getting our arms around. The biggest driver here is that last October, the state of California passed the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, or SB 253, which was a landmark climate rule mandating that large companies report climate emissions. It also enacted SB 261, which requires disclosure of climate-related financial risks. Now, these climate laws represent an important inflection point in state and federal climate legislation, really because California, which is the world's 5th largest economy by GDP and home to tech industry behemoths like Apple and Google and Microsoft, all of which, by the way, support this climate legislation. But California, I think, as we know, certainly in the building industry, has been the harbinger for climate and environmental policies, really across the entire economy, but particularly building-related codes and mandates. And so right now, other states like New York and Colorado and Massachusetts are really keeping a keen eye on what's happening in California. And so this Climate Accountability Act, as I mentioned, requires scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting from public and private companies that do business in the state and make more than $1 billion in annual revenue per calendar year. Now, a lot of the big companies that do support, like the tech companies that do support this legislation, are actually kind of already monitoring and measuring and reporting on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Now, critics of this climate disclosure law say that actually the largest burden of these regulations actually will be on the smaller companies and the service providers and the vendors to the large companies who aren't already reporting on their emissions and are going to have to, because they will be required to report their emissions, scope 1 and 2, and probably ultimately scope 3 emissions to the larger companies. So what this legislation does is it's a really big push forward towards climate disclosure for companies of all sizes, not just the ones that meet the $1 billion revenue threshold, but also the ones that sell to, interact with, and service those larger companies. And so it's important that companies that do business in the state of California or with businesses in California that start thinking about the measures needed to comply with this ultimately, inevitable shift in climate disclosure regulations. We also, again, see this shift in SEC regulations, which are now requiring that publicly traded companies report on their scope 1 and 2 emissions, as well as providing disclosure on how extreme weather events and other natural occurrences can impact the financials. We've also seen a few other things. So for example, the Department of Energy put out a zero emissions building definition, defining zero emissions buildings as highly energy efficient. They do not emit greenhouse gases directly from energy use, and they're powered solely by clean energy. So they're kind of putting some guardrails around what zero emissions buildings are. We're now seeing also voluntary carbon offset guidelines that were recently released by the Biden administration that put some guardrails around understanding what high quality carbon offset projects look like. I'll get more into those elements in a little while when I talk specifically about carbon offsets. But then we also saw that there was a new code in California that went into effect at the beginning of July this year that requires owners of new buildings that are 10,000 square feet or larger to calculate embodied carbon emissions, use low carbon products and materials, implement procurement policies that prioritize environmentally responsible sourcing of products, and utilize offset modular and prefab construction as much as possible to minimize on-site waste and emissions. And then finally, the Boston Planning and Development Agency, the BPDA, approved a zero carbon emissions requirement for certain types of buildings that are permitted after July 1 of next year, 2025. And these new zoning requirements will also require real estate developers to report on their projects' embodied carbon, which includes raw material, procurement for products, manufacturing, transportation, construction, demolition, and waste disposal. So the writing is on the wall. These are just a few examples. There are many others that I could cite, but clearly we're moving in the direction of zero carbon. Now, I am not a green builder, I am not a building scientist, and I am not a sustainable architect. However, I've got good friends who are. They instruct me on how to build net zero carbon. That is not the focus of today's webinar. We have awesome content through our Housing 2.0 program with Sam Rashkin, who's former chief architect of the Department of Energy and considered to be the father of Energy Star. I highly recommend, if you haven't gone through the Housing 2.0 curriculum, please check it out. It's fantastic. We're doing a Vision House project, one of our demonstration projects, with Peter Pfeiffer, who's considered to be one of the OGs, one of the original sustainable architects here in this country. He's an AIA fellow and totally focused on net zero carbon and climate responsive sustainable design practices. So you can learn a lot through our current Vision House Austin project about sustainable design to get to net zero carbon. And we've got all kinds of content on our website at greenbuildermedia.com to inform you more about sustainable design, building science, and green building best practices to get to a net zero carbon built environment. However, the fundamentals are pretty straightforward. First, we've got to look at design that is climate responsive, that uses passive design strategies where windows are shaded in the summertime and collect heat in the wintertime. That's critical. We also need to look at taking advantage of what Peter Pfeiffer talks about as the gospel of ambient energy, deploying climate responsive design, passive heating, cooling, and ventilation strategies, and building science best practices that enhance energy efficiency, resiliency, durability, and thermal comfort. We also, of course, need to look at electrification. Actually, I'm on the wrong slide here. So here's the slide I really want to be talking to right now. We also need to look at electrification. So we are seeing not just advancements in technologies like heat pump, technologies for heating, cooling, water heaters, clothes dryers. We're seeing advanced air-to-air, air-to-water, water-to-water heat pumps for all climates, even cold climates. We're seeing demand response features for water heaters and heat pump technologies. And then we're also starting to see companies like Bosch, as a great example, becoming a one-stop shop for home comfort installation and service. So, for example, Bosch has smart thermostats that interacts with all of their products and does demand-side energy management and peak load shifting and peak load shedding. They also have control boards that have proactive performance analysis and other sustainable solutions. As well as partner programs where contractors can register products for points and rewards and get lead gen. Then, of course, adopting renewable energy is just a no-brainer at this point, particularly because the economics really make sense. And then my good friend Steve Easley, who's a building science consultant, tells me that it is of paramount importance that we inspect, test, and measure performance all along the way, right? Not just after a home or a building is up and running. Now, I want to go back to this evolving economics slide because this is really important. I mentioned this earlier, but we have seen in the last couple of years that our audience, again, early adopter and first mover consumers, are shifting from looking at from first cost to full cost, and looking at that total home ownership value. And so that is really important when it comes to a zero carbon built environment, because they're looking at the long-term impacts. Again, affordability is of paramount importance. I get that, especially in today's economy. But there's some different buying considerations now by home buyers. Another element that is driving towards a zero carbon built environment are those incentives and rebates. I mentioned 45L for builders under the Inflation Reduction Act, where they can get $2,500 for Energy Star certified homes and $5,000 for zero energy ready homes, and as well as, again, under the Inflation Reduction Act, the Homes and HERA programs for homeowners. So kind of on top of those 45L incentives, which help the economics work out better for builders, we're seeing a whole suite of incentives and tax and rebates for consumers for heat pump technology, smart electric panels, electrical wiring, water heaters, upgrades like insulation, air sealing and ventilation, windows and doors, etc. Now, In order to get to a zero carbon environment, first we need to start with what I mentioned in terms of sustainable design practices, building science best practices, and green construction best practices. Next, we have to look at the meticulous specification of low carbon products. And this is really interesting, and I put this copy on here even though there's a lot of words, but specifying low carbon products within homes and buildings is challenging because there are about 20,000 product inputs and about 450 SKUs in a typical American home, and only a small pool of available low carbon products to choose from. Fortunately, the demand for and the response, the demand for environmental product declarations or EPDs and the response from manufacturers is really, really growing in momentum. So an EPD is a standardized document that communicates the environmental performance and human health impact of a product over its lifetime. EPDs follow specific international standards to ensure that the reporting of environmental data is consistent, transparent, and reliable. So, for example, they follow the ISO 14025 and the EN 15804. I won't go into those details of what those are, but certainly, the process of creating an EPD involves third-party verification to ensure accuracy and reliability. And EPDs really add the credibility and transparency claims made by the manufacturers about their products so that consumers can make, or buyers can make more informed decisions, and also so that they can compare products by one manufacturer versus another. EPDs are based on products lifecycle assessments, or LCAs, which measure potential environmental impact from natural resource acquisition to production and use stage, and ultimately to end-of-life disposal or recycling. Now, there's a couple kinds of EPDs. One is a cradle-to-gate EPD, which is basically, raw material procurement to the installation of that product, versus a cradle to grave EPD, which actually measures the life cycle all the way through to, let's say, reuse or recycling or end-of-life considerations. There are fortunately a growing number of companies with EPDs. And one of our sponsors for this webinar, James Hardy, is an excellent example of a standout company with EPDs. In fact, I recently learned that James Hardy generates 94% of its revenue from products that actually have EPDs. And that's pretty incredible with respect to the level of commitment to EPDs and the number of EPDs that just manufacturers in general have. James Hardy, as I said, is really a standout company in this area. And so to James Hardy, an EPD is a way to really offer, insight into how the company creates, markets, and disposes of their products. Their EPDs are cradle to grave, not just cradle to gate. And it includes, for example, a reference to a process of recarbonization, which is a natural process where their fiber cement products react with the air and actually reabsorb CO2 gradually over the lifetime of the product. And so those EPDs and the process of actually getting those EPDs have led James Hardy to develop what they're calling a low carbon cement technology roadmap, which is super important given the high intensity of cement and concrete. And the low carbon cement technology roadmap for James Hardy involves a 50% reduction in related CO2 emissions by 2030 with the development of lower carbon cement with better recarbonization processes. So beyond the EPDs, though, it's really important when builders and consumers and architects and other specifiers are looking for low carbon products, not just to look at product information, but also company information. So looking at corporate sustainability and climate commitments, looking at ESG strategies and reporting, looking at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Do these companies report on those scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? Do they even know what those scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are? I will say that many companies that I talk with have a handle on their scope 1 and 2 emissions, But scope 3 is a different story entirely. I think we're seeing a lot of movement towards companies, manufacturers in particular, trying to get their arms around scope 3 emissions. They're not quite there yet. And then are they already disclosing their climate risk, either because they have to, because they're publicly traded, and they're now required to by the SEC, or they hit that revenue threshold in California, or because maybe they do, maybe they're a European company and the EU already requires scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for larger companies. So I think that, again, this is really an inevitable transformation of the built environment. Now, we recently put out a survey to our builder audience about EPDs and came back with some pretty interesting insights. So about 67% of our builder audience are very familiar with EPDs, and they tell us 50% say that they look for EPDs, although that's not a deal breaker, whereas about 40% are saying now that EPDs are really a must as they start specifying products, which is a big change in the last couple of years. In fact, I just saw a chart this morning, and I meant to include it in this slideshow. I just didn't have time to cut and paste it. But if you're interested in this data, I have my email at the end, and you can email me and ask me for this. But Ecomedes, which is a database of kind of EPD and other green product certifications, just released some data that says that now EPDs are the #1 type of certification that their users are actually searching for. And it wasn't the case, that wasn't the case even just a couple of years ago. More people were searching for, say, Energy Star certified products or WaterSense certified products, but now it's products with EPDs. And 85% of our builders now specify products with EPDs. That's not necessarily across all of the products that they specify in their homes, because there just aren't that many. But then you can see here very high levels. 50% of our builders tell us that EPDs will become a factor in the next year if they're not already specifying products with EPDs, and about 45%, say yes in the next few years. We also know that EPDs are important to our builder respondents so that they have a product roadmap, so that they can meet regulatory requirements, and then also to meet consumer demand and ESG goals. When specifying EPDs, our builder audience say that they rely on a blend of industry average and product-specific EPDs. The majority do, and then a little bit less than that look for those product-specific EPDs. So if you're on this webinar or listening to it afterwards and you're a manufacturer, EPDs are important, and product-specific EPDs are becoming more and more important. And then our builder audience tells us that EPDs are considered during the product specification stage, as well as during the design phase for the most part. And then we are seeing that 65% of our builders say that their home buyers and consumers are increasingly demanding products with EPDs. About 20% say that consumers are familiar with EPDs, but they're not familiar with EPDs, excuse me, that term in particular, but they are asking for product certification and verification. Now, moving on, another incredibly important aspect of getting to a net zero carbon built environment is looking for products that can be inputted into the circular economy. Which is, if we look at our current, in contrast to our current take and waste model, a circular economy is designed to decouple growth from consumption of finite resources by sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, and recycling existing materials, natural resources, products, and energy. So in the built environment, this means, reusing products and materials without breaking them down or degrading them. We are starting to see more and more material passports being required in Europe, which are really a record of materials, products, and components that go into homes and buildings. And they help stakeholders kind of along the way understand what goes into a home or building, and then how to either extract those products and reuse them, or kind of deal with them disassemble and kind of get them back into a biological or a technological loop as opposed to taking them to a landfill. Now, one of the most important aspects of getting to a net zero carbon built environment quickly involves carbon offsets. At Green Builder Media, we are huge advocates of carbon offsets because, look, we must decarbonize our economy through the electrification of buildings and transportation, the adoption of renewable energy, modification of manufacturing, the deployment of regenerative agricultural practices, but these things take time. And so while those 2030 goals that I mentioned earlier are of paramount importance, we're just not going to meet our climate goals if we just stick with those 2030 commitments, which inevitably leads us to the conclusion that carbon offsets have to play a vital role in helping us reach those climate goals. So for those of you who aren't familiar with carbon offsets, a carbon offset is a transaction basically that removes carbon from another greenhouse gases from the air. So one carbon offset is the equivalent of taking 1 ton of carbon out of the air. And the most common carbon offset projects today include forest management and conservation, biodiversity protection, emissions reduction, so landfill gas capture, biochar, direct air capture, looking at, for example, landfill to waste technologies and opportunities. And I think that carbon offsets are of paramount importance really because they help us get what I'm calling to the last mile, right? So we have to have the performance first, but those carbon offsets help us get the rest of the way to a net zero built environment. And I'll get into a little bit more of that in a second. But first, unfortunately, the voluntary carbon offsets market has been kind of rife with challenges and has a little bit of a bad rap. And to be clear, so highly emitting and polluting companies are required to purchase carbon offsets. The rest of us engage in what's called the voluntary carbon offset market. And there's a big chasm between high quality and low quality carbon offsets. And I mentioned earlier that the Biden administration just put out some guidelines for what really defines a high quality carbon offset project. And so those things include addressing additionality. So they're doing something that wouldn't have been done otherwise. They provide robust and timely data and reporting. They eliminate double accounting. This was actually one of the biggest issues with the voluntary carbon offsets market, is that there were companies or carbon offset projects that were, say, planting a tree and then selling that tree to 10 or 100 people. They're permanent. They ensure the permanent removal of carbon. They create, they have third-party validation, and they also offer well-defined pricing and benefits, and they really can articulate what their environmental impact is. We are seeing that there's a high level of interest in carbon offsets, which is great. You can see the numbers here. Again, these are from Cognition, where nearly 100% of the building product manufacturers that we ask if they're interested in purchasing carbon offsets, they say yes. 72% of building professionals are interested, and 89% of consumers or homeowners are interested in purchasing carbon offset to offset their homes and lifestyle. Now, the biggest concern about carbon offsets is that they help enable greenwashing, and that's certainly true. If there's a highly polluting company that buys carbon offsets and says they're carbon neutral, then that's greenwashing. Just as if a builder builds a poorly performing home and slaps carbon offsets onto it and says that it's carbon neutral, that's greenwashing too. However, as I said earlier, there just simply are not enough low carbon products, net zero carbon transportation options, installation practices, operational practices to create net zero carbon homes and buildings. So we have to use carbon offsets. We just have to be very realistic about where we are and what the options are available to us. And so again, Green Builder Media has decided just to go all Elon Musk on this marketplace, and we just redid the voluntary carbon offsets marketplace. So instead of buying offsets from exchanges or doing a bunch of research to look at different carbon offset projects, we have crafted a partnership with a company called CNOT, who has a fleet of PhDs that is vetting carbon offset projects for us and creating high quality, science-backed, Oxford-based carbon portfolios of carbon offset projects for us that differ a little bit in pricing just based on the permanence of the projects. They're all very high quality. But what we have decided to do is just basically streamline access to high quality carbon offsets for builders, manufacturers, and consumers, distributors, and other stakeholders in the built environment. So we're specifically focused on carbon offsets for the built environment. We also provide training and education. We provide, of course, the certification. We even provide marketing materials and collateral. I'm here to talk about net zero carbon homes and buildings, not to give you a sales pitch, but we're incredibly excited about this, not only because we get to streamline that access to carbon offsets, but really more importantly, we're putting together a network of builders and building professionals, manufacturers, and other stakeholders who are leading the charge to net zero carbon. So again, if you're interested in learning more about that, please let me know, shoot me an email after this webinar and we can talk some more. Now, I want to shift into talking about how we measure carbon. There's kind of two aspects of carbon emissions for the built environment. There is embodied carbon, which encompasses everything that, from raw material extraction, transportation, manufacturing, more transportation, installation, packaging waste, and on-site construction activity. So the way that I look at it is embodied carbon measures the carbon of a home or a building up until, let's just use homes for this purposes of this conversation, up until that home is sold, the day that home is sold. Operational carbon then measures emissions from the ongoing operations of that home. And so while embodied carbon looks at things like concrete, highly emitting, highly intensive products that are used in that home, like concrete and steel, even solar, all of those things, certain types of insulation, those drive up embodied carbon. Solar, interestingly, actually decreases operational carbon. And so, but other types of energy using products like HVAC, water heating appliances increase the operational carbon. So there's a couple of different ways to measure embodied carbon. First, it's really important, again, to look at what those high intensity materials are. You can use those EPDs to obtain emissions information, sometimes called emissions factors for each material and product used in the home. You can conduct a life cycle assessment using software tools like Beam, EC3, or One-Click LCA. I have been told that Beam, which is free, tends to be a preferred tool. I am, simply sharing insight provided to me by my builder friends and colleagues who have used various different tools. And for, accuracy and credibility, you might want to consider having embodied carbon assessments verified by third-party auditors. Our friend Chris Magwood at RMI just headed up a technical committee on behalf of ResNet to create what will become an ANSI standard for embodied carbon measurement. I'm told that's about a year out, but that will really kind of set a standard, literally and figuratively, for the measurement of embodied carbon. And then in the meantime, for builders and developers and other professionals that want more in-depth LCAs and maybe don't have the time to use those tools, there are some great companies like Construction Instruction that are working with builders to do LCAs on homes so that they can really do an in-depth analysis of embodied carbon. For operational carbon measurement, this one's also pretty interesting because you need to kind of look at not just energy use of the home, and does a home or a building have solar or solar plus storage? But also it's important to look at the power mix from the utility. So does that utility that provides energy to a home, if it's a grid tied home, use fossil fuels, or does it have a renewable blend? So it's important to understand that energy mix, again, if there is grid power. Now, utilities like NV Energy, I'll do a call out for them as well. They're really driving towards, really creating a clean grid and a clean portfolio of energy sources that they can provide to customers. In fact, NV Energy in particular has reduced its carbon intensity by 50% since 2005. It closed its last coal power plant last year, I believe. It's building out 12 major solar plus storage projects. 3 of those projects went online in 2023 and provided 478 megawatts of new solar power, and about 338 megawatts of energy storage, which powers over 101,000 homes in their area. And I also like to call out some builders that are really leading the charge, and there's 2 that we get to work with. One is Thrive Home Builders. They are kind of what I like to call the California of builders, meaning they're always the harbinger of like what's to come, and they're really looking at low carbon products and carbon. They're one of the only builders that I know right now actually purchasing carbon offsets. And then another builder I like to call out is Mattamy Homes. Philip Squires over there is really leading the charge and thinking very thoughtfully about low carbon products, and then also looking at making decisions that optimize for low carbon. So for example, in Ontario, where they actually don't install solar because the energy mix from the utility is so clean that it increases embodied carbon without providing other benefits. Of course, you can make the argument about resiliency and redundancy. That's a whole other conversation. Now, finally, I just want to talk about how to talk about zero carbon, because I think we've found over our decades of being in business that there are effective ways to talk about high performance home, healthy homes, net zero carbon homes now, and there are ineffective ways. And I think that what's really important is, in order to reach your customers, whether you're a manufacturer, a dealer, distributor, a builder, or other type of related stakeholder, you got to communicate where people are at. And so, I think what's important to communicate is that, on a per capita basis, the US has one of the highest rates of carbon emissions. And this is really an injustice and inequity that a lot of millennials and Gen Zs are internalizing. And, so I think that being able to look at and talk about carbon emissions as something that's real and that's normalized, and by being able to deliver low carbon products and net zero carbon homes, you are indeed actually addressing some of these topics that are most important to home buyers in general, but particularly these younger home buyers. So you're kind of future-proofing their future, so to speak. Another element that I think is really important is just the behavioral change. We look at presenting different types of scenarios, whether that's, say, heating and cooling scenarios, looking at a decrease in carbon emissions if you set your temperature accordingly in winter and summer, or looking at kind of old tech versus new tech, right? How, Energy Star refrigerators save, about 0.5 tons of carbon emissions annually over older models. And then, of course, kind of connecting carbon to real life, right? So a homeowner who does 100 loads of laundry a year can save 500 pounds of carbon emissions annually by using cold water instead of hot water. So there's, some very simple and easy facts. Green Builder Media in our August issue of Green Builder Magazine has a great article on kind of humanizing the conversation, kind of connecting CO2 to daily decisions and showcasing how home owners, home buyers, consumers in general can really make better carbon-based decisions in their lives. Everything from looking at how they can access renewable energy, to waste management, to buying electric vehicles, telecommuting, flying thoughtfully, and buying carbon offsets for travel. So I encourage you to take a look at that article. Finally, the last thing I just want to say is, if all of this is interesting to you, we have so much more content, as I mentioned, Housing 2.0, it's free. It's a free educational course with Sam Rashkin. We also now have extensive content on our Cognition Academy platform on everything from green building fundamentals, green product essentials. We have a whole course on net zero carbon building. We have courses on specific products like heat pumps and advanced demand-side energy management systems. We've got courses on decarbonization, ESG, circularity, and climate risk disclosure. So here's my email. Feel free to shoot me a note, ask me any questions that you may have. I am going to look at the question and answer here. I think what I'm going to do actually is, because I ran a little late and I want to end on time, if you do have any questions that you'd like from me, that you'd like to ask, just shoot me an email after, and I'll respond that way rather than trying to take more of your time today. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Again, thank you so much to Mary Kessner. Thank you all for being here. And a special thanks to Bosch Home Comfort Group, James Hardy, and PowerShift by NB Energy. Again, without the generosity of our sponsors, we couldn't do the work that we do. And we also appreciate their innovation and their creativity. So thank you all so much, and look forward to hearing from you if you have any feedback in general about this webinar. This will be the first in a whole series of net zero carbon webinars and content that we provide. This is a big area of focus right now for Green Builder Media. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you so much.